Welcome to the first ever KokoCast, a video podcast inspired by the incredible gorilla Koko, who learned to communicate with humans using a combination of American Sign Language and gorilla natural gestures. The purpose of these KokoCasts is to ask world experts on great ape conservation and interspecies communication questions posed by you, people of all ages who care about our fellow great apes and who believe in the power of communication to heal the planet. I'm Dr. Christa Nunes, Associate Director at the Gorilla Foundation, and I've been working closely with Dr. Penny Patterson, the Foundation's co-founder, and with Koko for almost 20 years. Today, we have two guests, Dr. Patterson, Koko's lifelong mentor and president of the Gorilla Foundation, in conversation with Ian Redmond, chairman of the Ape Alliance and co-founder of Ecoflix, the first streaming media nonprofit dedicated to saving nature. And we'll be addressing questions ranging from how Penny and Ian developed an interest in gorillas to the problems facing gorillas both in the wild and in captivity, as well as solutions to those problems, things we can do today to change their status from a critically endangered species to a critically loved and respected species that we continue to have a dialogue with. So let's begin, Penny. How did you first get interested in working with great apes and gorillas in particular?
I guess it was when I started reading the literature on language communication with chimpanzees, mainly at that time. And the gardeners came to Stanford and gave a lecture. I asked them if I could visit. They said no. But I had an opportunity. And I always thought that the great apes were the greatest of the animal kingdom, and they still are. For me, they're above us. But because they're so wise and so wonderful. But that's really, it just sort of came from that naturally. Anyway, from my proclivity for animals, more animals in my life. Because they had been so little studied. That was it. I was reading Robert Yerke's accounts of a gorilla that he said he couldn't prove it, but he knew she was intelligent. She was stubborn, and she was manipulative. But so after reading that, it was both fascination with them because they were little known in those days back then, and just a good fit.
What are the main differences between gorillas, chimps, bonobos, and orangutans?
I think they're all intelligent, very intelligent, and gorillas, according to your case, more intelligent than they could prove, because there was this little hint of stubbornness. And being as large as they were, they could do anything they wanted. So really they are, but they're different though. Their social structures are different. Gorillas, the male is responsible for the family and everything else. Chimps is just a free floating organization of individuals and groups. And bonobos, it's females. The female's the leader. I like that one.
Ian, how did you become interested in great apes and gorillas in particular?
For me, it was very much the fickle finger of fate, because when I was at university as an undergraduate, I took on the task of organizing speakers for the Biology Society. And in the case of this particular lecture, it was a then PhD student writing up his research at Cambridge, having spent 2 years working with Diane Fossey, who at that time, this is in the early 70s, mid 70s, wasn't so well known worldwide as she is today. But his name was Sandy Harcourt, and Sandy's gave a talk about his work, and I put him up in my flat for the night, and we talked into the early hours. And I was very keen to get the address of the research centre where he'd been, which he kindly gave me. And he gave me a very useful tip. He said, if you have any aptitude in mending things, you should mention that, because when you live in a cabin in the middle of a forest miles from any civilization, when something breaks, it stays broken. So, and luckily I'm a sort of a compulsive fixer, so I can't help but try and mend things if I see they're broken. So I wrote to Diane Fossey saying, hey, my academic supervisors don't rate me that highly, but I travel a lot. I love nature and would like to come and help if I can. So if you want someone to mend the roof or make the tea, just drop that in there. Then I'll be happy to help. And heard nothing for months, of course. But that was in the days when you wrote to someone literally by hand writing and put it in the post, and it traveled to Africa. And I didn't know at the time, but it would then get picked up by the head porter and carried with a long line of porters in boxes on the head up to the research center. And then Diane would open it, and if she got round to replying, then she would give the porter a letter and he would take it down to the post office. And then so it was about a month round trip for post anyway, and I probably wasn't at the top of her list of people to respond to. So it was many months later when I got a letter back saying, if what you say is true and you can get here, we'll try you. So that was that's how it started. And oddly enough, that was what Diane set me to do. After a few days being introduced to the study groups, she liked new researchers to go off and experience it like it was when she first arrived, i.e. no cabins. And so we went off to do some census work on the slopes of Karisimbi and living under canvas. And for me, it was fantastic. I mean, I love being outdoors. I love wilderness areas. The fact that it rained a lot and was quite cold isn't really a problem if you've spent your boyhood in Yorkshire. It rains a lot and it's often quite cold. So it suited me down to the ground. And the fact that you got to meet and interact with gorillas was just amazing. And the gorillas we went off on that first camping trip were, of course, unhabituated. They weren't used to people, so they would scream at you and try and frighten you to run away. And you're supposed to try and get a fix on them with your binoculars and make a sketch of the shape of the folds of skin above their nose and see if you can recognize individuals whilst not being intimidated by their screaming charges and nervous behavior.
So you weren't able to get very close to the gorillas at first?
Not what used to be known as the fringe groups. In those days, only really 3 families were habituated. The ones on the edge of the study areas occasionally saw people, but once you got beyond that, they were completely wild, and they regarded humans as very dangerous and would either run away at the first sight or sound or smell of human, or if you persisted, then the silverback would obviously try and frighten you away. So you were dealing with unhabituated gorillas that were not used to people, and it was much more dramatic. Now when people visit Rwanda or Uganda or the Democratic Republic of Congo and visit the tourist groups, the groups that are used to visitors, they're calm and relaxed. And you just get to sort of spend an hour in their company at the now 10-meter distance. The distance has been increased to protect them from potential infection with COVID-19. So now you try and keep a bit more of a distance, but in the early days, those rules hadn't been invented, and gorillas would come up and study you. So you'd be trying to study them, and once they got used to you, they would come and examine you. I mean, gorillas have got a mind and a lot of curiosity, so they'd come and do their research on the humans while the humans were doing the research on the gorillas.
Did you learn more from Diane Fossey or directly from the gorillas?
Well, I think both. Obviously, Diane she was a trailblazer. She had developed the methods for winning the trust of gorillas. So the Fossey method, which is to keep low and make gorilla contentment sounds. You tend to be feeding. You sounded like you're inoffensive and not dangerous. All those methods were what enabled us to go even with unhabituated gorilla groups and get their curiosity. And so that Fossey method is the basis, I think, for ape habituation in other places now. So I learned that from Diane, and I learned by example, her determination. You know, she from 1967, when she first arrived, to her murder in just after Christmas, 85, most of that span of time, she was on the mountain and just driven to find out more about gorillas and to ensure that they survived, because that was the big lesson. My first day in the field, when Diane said, go with Tim White, the American traveler who I was replacing. He'd been helping her out. She said, go and study group 4, you know, learn about making gorilla observations. And we ran into poacher trail. And Tim explained, well, the rule at camp is if you find signs of poachers, you follow that. And if they're setting snares, you cut those snares, because if you don't, then you might be studying gorillas getting caught in snares. And so we followed the poacher trail and ended up raiding a poacher camp, which was very dramatic as my initiation to field work. Lesson 1, deal with the poachers before you do your research. That was a big lesson Diane tried to teach to every student, that the safety of the animals was more important than your research.
Wow, Ian, that does sound very dramatic. Penny, we're going to move on now. I have a question for you about Koko specifically. What was it like when you first met her?
Well, when I first met Koko, she just seemed really curious and about me, and was, you know, a little bit feisty. I'm trying to separate in my mind that if I came without Ron or whether we came together the first time. But the first time that we were both together, she clearly gravitated toward the male, to Ron. And she had was living in the same quarters with Landis Bell, who was her daddy figure and playful companion. So she didn't want anything to do with me. When a male stepped into the room, she thought, oh, goody. And she had this gesture, which we translated as walk up my back, which was one of the playthings that Landis did with her in tickling games.
Was there a point when you first knew that you and Koko were going to get along?
Well, it just seemed like she was an infant and I was, you know, someone experienced in raising kids, being from a family of 7, the oldest female. And so she was very, very receptive to being held and being carried around, signed up very early on and other things. So it was just, you know, being mom, playing mom to another infant, very, very similar, the development and stages. She didn't want me to leave her at night. So she would cry and I would come back and sit until she was sleeping and then try to creep out of the room, and that might work and it might not work. The zoo director asked me how long I would be helping. I was volunteering basically. And I said, well, at least 4 years was my time at Stanford. And he was saying, well, the average with Koko was 3 weeks for volunteers. I'm not sure why. but you know, we you know, it was fine. I was like delighted to be able to have the time with her every day, driving up to San Francisco Zoo and finally moving her facility, which and Dr. Carl Pribram helped secure, from off. First of all, we got out of the public view, and that was step 1, which is really good. And then step 2 is moving it to Stanford, where I was still a student and needing to study as well as work with Koko.
Was there a point when you realized I'm going to be doing this for the rest of my life?
Yeah, it was like a few days in.
Wow.
I think so. I mean, there were other volunteers. Barbara Hiller was one of them, who became one of the founders of the Gorilla Foundation. And so she was one of those that lasted much longer than 3 weeks. So, and ended up being part of our foundation and working with Koko as she took a bus down to Stanford from San Francisco every day, and truly dedicated. So somehow there are some of us for whom we will do anything, basically.
How did you first become aware of Ian's work?
I'm sure I was aware of his work before we met at a conference in what in I'm trying to think of that where we were.
Ian, do you remember?
I do, yes. It was a bit of a red letter day for me because I've been reading about Penny's work for years. It was at the Great Ape Conference in Kuching.
Yes, so it was great being able to go to those conferences and meet people firsthand that we had, both only read about.
It will forever be a regret to me that I didn't get to meet Koko. Although I don't speak American Sign Language, I speak gorilla, but with a heavy mountain gorilla accent, so I don't know what she would have made of that. But no, it's just geography. When I'm based in the UK and work a lot in Africa and Southeast Asia, and on the occasions that I've done American lecture tours, they haven't, unfortunately, landed me on your doorstep. Otherwise, I would have been knocking on your door the same as I did with Diane Fossey.
Well, if you knocked on our door, we would have let you in, Ian. Why do you think there isn't more cooperation between great ape conservation groups or collaboration?
Human nature. People get on with what they're doing and aren't necessarily open to sharing, particularly if what they're doing is so engrossing, and studying any of the great apes is engrossing. And if you're doing it professionally, then you have to keep focus. But meetings of primatologists are great places for sharing experiences, as was the Great Ape Conference in Kuching. But that sort of sometimes I would even say blinkered or tunnel vision that people have to do their particular work because that's what's on their agenda can be a hindrance, particularly in conservation, but also in just in research. So that's why in 1996, I contacted the heads of a lot of organizations that support ape conservation and welfare. And we sat around a table in the Royal Geographical Society in London and called ourselves the Ape Alliance. And I'm still chairing that coalition. It's a loose coalition. It doesn't tell people what to do. It just provides a platform for collaboration and cooperation between organizations, not just for great apes, but also for gibbons and siamangs, because they're all in desperate need of help. And if people know that organizations dedicated to their survival are collaborating, I think they'll have more confidence than if they see them in competition with each other. So I'm very much in favor of working together.
How much have things changed for great apes since you both first met in Kuching in 2000?
Broad brushstrokes, there are far fewer non-human great apes and far more human great apes now than there were then. So in that sense, all our aspirations to turn things around have not been successful, with the single exception of the mountain gorillas. And such has been the level of concern and global fundraising, coupled with the development of the mountain gorilla tourism, that brought in both visitors who then became ambassadors for the species and revenues that paid for the protection and helped the communities around the park to improve their standard of living. That has transformed mountain gorilla conservation. And apart from humans, they're the only kind of ape whose numbers increase year on year at the moment. But they've just got into 4 figures. They're just over 1,000, whereas we're at 7.5 billion and rising. So we have to apply whatever lessons we learn from mountain gorillas to other populations of apes. They're all either endangered or critically endangered. Yeah. And that if you like, it's a success story that mountain gorillas are only endangered now. They were critically endangered, but because of this year-on-year increase for decades, the IUCN decided, okay, they're actually looking like they're going to survive, and we can reduce their threat status from critically endangered to endangered.
Mountain gorillas live in a pretty isolated area, don't they?
They only live in these two small pockets of forest, about 20 miles apart, and that's the Virunga population and the Bwindi and Sorambwe population.
Okay.
But when people think of gorillas from having seen them on television, usually they're thinking of mountain gorillas because they have been studied, filmed, and visited by tourists. So that's the most photographed kind of gorilla in the wild. If you go to zoos, the captive gorillas are almost without exception all western lowland gorillas, which is now considered to be a separate species from the mountain gorilla.
Right.
And each species, the eastern, which includes the mountain and the eastern lowland, and the western, which includes the western lowland and the cross river gorilla, they're all facing, well, some of the same threats and some different. Mountain gorillas only live in protected areas, which are also World Heritage Sites and which also have the revenue from tourism. So they really are properly protected areas. The other gorillas, Eastern Lowland, Western Lowland, and Cross River, are still declining in numbers, despite efforts to turn that around. And there are more of some of them, especially the Western Lowland, which might be a couple of 100,000. We don't know because they live in very dense forests and it's very hard to count them. But from counts of certain areas and then extrapolating, that is the current estimate, far more than we thought. 20 years ago, we thought there were fewer than 100,000, and there's actually probably twice that. But their numbers are in decline. They were badly hit by Ebola, and they continue to be hit by bushmeat hunting and by the capture of babies.
Do people continue to eat gorillas in Africa due to the illegal bushmeat trade?
Across the 10 countries where gorillas live naturally in Africa, from the bottom right-hand corner of Nigeria to Rwanda and Uganda, there are many different cultures in the human population. Some of those tribal cultures regard gorilla meat as really special meat that only VIPs, chiefs, and visiting dignitaries are served. Others regard them as just big animals with a lot of meat. And if you're a hunter with that much money, you've got 2 cartridges, if you can kill a big animal, you're going to make more money for your family than if you kill a small animal. Mm-hmm. And other cultures would not eat gorillas the same as we would not eat gorillas because of their similarity to us. And it's strange. Some of their properties are exactly the same reason why some people eat them, so some people don't eat them. So that's just variety in human cultures. And whilst I disagree profoundly with the idea of eating gorillas, because I've met gorillas, some of my best friends have been gorillas, I don't want to demonize someone who grew up in a village where that's the norm, because I know that if I'd grown up in that village, I'd think that was the norm too.
What's the solution?
So the answer is not to demonize people, but to educate people. And the important lesson about gorillas, and indeed any ape conservation, and indeed any large, slowly reproducing mammal conservation, is that if you keep killing them faster than they can reproduce, and they all have a very slow rate of reproduction, then you will stop eating them. And you can stop when they've all gone, or you can stop before that and allow their numbers to recover, so that that part of your culture that doesn't involve killing them can appreciate them, and they can continue to play the role that they have evolved to play in these globally important ecosystems. So they're not just there as ornaments, as things for us to go and see on holiday. They play a critical role in Africa's forest ecosystems, and those forest ecosystems play an essential role in stabilizing our climate.
What about gorillas in captivity, for example, in zoos and sanctuaries?
Gorillas in captivity are a sort of a hangover from the 19th century. Because in the 19th century, when people from Europe and America first saw gorillas in the wild, it was usually down the barrel of a gun and with local people who were terrified of them. So the gorillas were terrified of humans, and the humans were terrified of gorillas. But even the first white man to observe gorillas before he shot them, Paul du Chaillu, an American of French extraction, who had spent his teenage years at his father's trading post on the west coast of Gabon. So he spoke some of the local languages, and he got backing to go and do a long walk around the forests of Gabon. And his book, Adventures and Explorations in Equatorial Africa, is riveting. If you can just excuse the fact that his mindset was, I'm here to kill and collect animals for museums. And when he tried to keep alive an infant from a mother that he shot, the infant died. Wouldn't be tamed, was struggling and died. And that was repeated for almost every hunter who tried to capture and keep alive baby gorillas. Turns out baby gorillas don't survive well the trauma that Penny heard described by Ndume. Yes, Michael. And I was thinking when you were talking about that traumatic experience for him as an infant would have been the memory of his father screaming and charging to defend the family and being shot, and his mother being shot, and him then surviving perhaps days or weeks, bundled up in a sack or in a small wicker basket and taken to a dealer who might have a bit more knowledge of how to keep young gorillas alive. But in 1989, I went to Congo, Brazzaville, to see the work of a French lady, Yvette Leroy, who was saving young gorillas. And she was the most successful person to do that, and yet only 20% survived. 80% died, because they're so traumatized by that awful experience of having both parents killed and then mistreated until they get to some caring hands. And that means that the multiplier effect is each baby gorilla, at least 2 adults are killed. So that's three dead if 4 out of 5 die. So one live gorilla that's rescued probably represents 14 gorillas dead and 1 alive, because 4 out of 5 die. And you just do the math. And that's the minimum, because often there's more than one adult male that gets killed. If the silverback has a grown-up son, he'll have to be shot too. And so it's carnage, and most of them die. So the fact that some gorillas survived to get to captivity means that someone had enough maternal care, even if it was a bloke, acting as a surrogate parent, to keep that infant alive till it got to a zoo. And then very often they died in zoos because of colds, because there was, those days there were just bars, not glass. And then when glass was introduced, that mortality from respiratory infections dropped off. But there were still zookeepers at the turn of the century saying, no one's ever going to keep gorillas to breed them in captivity. So when they did that, it was a sort of success from the breeding point of view, but I cannot forget how they all got there. Now most gorillas in zoos are born in captivity. I wonder, well, how many generations is it okay to keep a vibrant part of a rainforest ecology in captivity? Because all the things that they do in the wild that make them successful tend to be suppressed in captivity. All that screaming, charging, chest beating, fighting, ooh, that's a bit disturbing for the visitors. So that sort of behavior is suppressed or avoided. And their main life decisions are taken for them. Whereas in the wild, each individual assesses when they feel confident enough to leave their family group. If they're a female going to join another male, or if they're a silverback, are they going to go? Are they going to stay and see if the old man dies and they can take over the family group? All those decisions are taken by the gorillas. They are autonomous beings. And that's what I think people really need to understand. That gorillas, as with all the great apes, now, and I would argue elephants and whales and dolphins, are intelligent, long-lived animals whose society is complex enough that natural selection has evolved in they've each evolved self-awareness, each of these different species, from very different roots. You know, dolphins are nothing like humans anatomically. Gorillas are, so you can see the resemblance. But whether it's a gorilla or a dolphin or a whale or an elephant, it is that ability to play your way in a complex society, know how your behavior is going to affect others, theory of mind, assess a situation. All that thinking is going on in gorilla society. What pains me most when I visit gorillas in captivity is that they don't have that autonomy. All the decisions, it's like institutionalized people. When we used to keep people who had learning difficulties in an institution, they just sat and rocked because they had nothing else to do. And when you see gorillas sitting and rocking, you think, my God, that's another mind that is being tortured by that situation. So I don't feel great when I visit gorillas in zoos. I know that the keepers who look after them care for them passionately. And so my best gorilla friends are gorilla keepers, because they're as unhappy with the lot that these gorillas have, and they do their utmost to do what they can to help the gorillas. But given the policies of the zoo community in trying to maximize genetic diversity, they put that as a higher priority than the emotional bonds between gorillas or between gorillas and humans.
Is there a need to have gorillas in zoos so humans can empathize with them and support them in the wild?
I think that was the case in the 19th and early 20th century, when people could not learn about gorillas by any other means. I've got lots of 19th century books, and they're line drawings, woodcuts, that illustrate an artist's image of what the hunter told him, but the artist had never seen a gorilla. And then late 19th century, early 20th century black and white photography. Now we've got VR headsets. We can put this on and we can be in a forest surrounded by gorillas. We don't need them in a cage. So people argue, well, we've got them in cages. What are we going to do with them?
That's a good point, Ian. What should we do to help the nearly 1,000 gorillas who are already in captivity?
Give them the best life you can. But every infant that is born, whilst being the best environmental enrichment possible for the mother and other family members, if that infant is destined for a lifetime in captivity, which might be 50 years or more, you're bringing up a kid to live in basically a concrete yard with some fancy bits, but not fancy bits that the gorillas can destroy. So if there's a tree there, it's got a hot wire around it. So it's a quality of life which really is disturbingly bleak. And that I cannot see the ethical justification for doing that generation after generation after generation. So unless a zoo is actively involved in looking to put gorillas back in the wild, that this is a captive breeding project with a view to restoring the gorilla function in a forest where they've been extirpated, then I find it very hard to justify the excuse that, oh, well, people will be interested in gorillas is no longer necessary, because now we have VR, we have IMAX cinemas, we can learn about gorillas without having to keep them in the middle of a city, people to go and see on a Sunday when they've got nothing better to do.
But isn't reintroducing gorillas into the wild dangerous? Aren't you just making them vulnerable to poachers?
That is a strong argument. And the only zoo, or two zoos, both with the same organization, the Aspinall Foundation, that has actually put captive bred gorillas from Kent in England into the forest in Africa. It's tempting to say put them back in Africa. They've never been to Africa. They were born in Kent. But they've been introduced to their native land where their parents came from, in a forest where gorillas had been extirpated, but is now a protected area. So that is creating a new gorilla population where they used to live, but no longer do. And the communities around that forest are part of that enterprise to protect them. And that's a very bold and radical thing. And it disappoints me how few zoos are looking at that as part of their long-term planning.
Penny, what do you think about the status of gorillas in captivity?
Well, I think first, what we're doing in terms of showing the level of intelligence and needs for autonomy are the best thing, and make that the public aware that that's what is going on, that this is, you know, it's great and fun to see them, but they're not having fun. And gorillas like Ndume find a way, they can't control his of throwing and banging at the public, so they have to invent distancing for him. He's very expressive of his opinion of being watched, you know, like he's some sort of circus display. He's very uncomfortable with strange humans watching him, and he shows it. So that he's a teacher too. I would think that people are thoughtful and see that, go, this isn't right. And if enough people feel this isn't right for the reasons we've discussed and can discuss more, the more likely it is the zoos will be nudged into looking at the other option and putting them back in the forest where their parents came from is the best one. There are also some sanctuary situations. Maybe that's next best. I don't know.
The very first thing that could be done is to give them more autonomy throughout their day, allow them a choice of whether they're going to be on or off exhibit, let them choose if they want to be inside or outside as a very first step. But I think moving more toward zoos as sanctuaries is what we should be thinking about, and provide an experience like Ian was talking about, where they're wearing the virtual reality glasses and it's like they're in the forest with the gorillas in Africa, but then the gorillas who are captive here don't have to suffer. I mean, it breaks my heart to think about Ndume's life at the foundation versus his life now, where he got to be outside every day. It was his choice whether he wanted to be in or out. He was communicating with us in many different ways on a daily basis, but now it's not up to him if he wants to be outside. He spent many, many months when he first went there without a day outside at all. And the space that they have that the public sees is naturalistic, but the space where the family groups are often behind the scenes is cement and metal. So it's just, you know, if the public really knew what it was like for the gorillas on a daily basis, I don't think they would agree with keeping them captive. I mean, and they're designed for the public to have a good experience, right? As well as ease of care of the gorillas themselves. So I think we need to be thinking more of what do the gorillas need first before we think about what the public needs. Penny, what do you think about the role of interspecies communication in zoos?
Christa knows how much Ndume missed being able to communicate through sign, and how that was demonstrated when she visited.
Yeah, when I went, he was very eager to communicate with me, and not just in sign, but he understands English. So I would often ask him questions and give him a yes/no option to answer, and he would respond. So I think that was also a big change for him and hard, because he, when I was there, just so eager to communicate with me in many different ways. And they're not, and I'm not exactly sure why, but the zoo is not wanting to carry on what we did with Ndume at the foundation. So they feel like it would be disruptive to his life with the gorillas there. So they're not interested in carrying forward that communication. I also want to echo what Ian said about the caregivers at zoos. They care very deeply about the gorillas there. So I think it's just the overall policies of the zoos that need to change. Ian, what would you tell a young person wondering, how can I help gorillas?
Whether I'm speaking to children or adults, I urge them to use their 3 Ps, the power of their Ps. And the first P power is the power of their pocket, because when you buy something, your purchasing power travels around the world, and you can fund a guy with a chainsaw to cut down gorilla habitat or orangutan habitat. So be an ethical shopper. If you buy something, find out if it has palm oil in it, and if it has, ask the company. And these days you can communicate with the company direct, or look for the logo saying it's from a deforestation-free source. Because if you're irresponsible in your purchasing power, whether it's just cookies or candies from a store, then your pocket money is going to help cut down rainforests. So that's your first P. Your second P is your political power. And it doesn't matter whether you're old enough to vote, your parents can vote. And every elected politician knows that when you are a little bit older, you'll be voting. So they're elected to represent your views. How can they do that if they don't know what your views are? Write to your elected representative and say, look, this is really important. We need those forests in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America to continue stabilizing our climate. And the decisions we take can affect those. So you've got your purchasing power, your political power, and the third P, of course, is your personal power. Because we all can do stuff. We can raise money for charities, we can volunteer for charities, and there are many charities that help apes. I chair the Ape Alliance. Go to 4 as a number, 4apes.com, and you get a list of nearly 100 organizations working, including the Gorilla Foundation and the Gorilla Organization and other Born Free Foundation, WWF, all these different organizations that do stuff for apes. And they're all dependent on charitable giving, which is exactly the wrong way to do something as important as this. It shouldn't be down to people who've got a little bit of money left over at the end of the month can give it to charity. It's too important for that.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we really must do, and that is to sort of internalize the cost of protecting nature to the economy. And this is what I'm most excited about at the moment, working with the Assistant Director at the International Monetary Fund, Ralph Shami, and a blockchain specialist in London called Walid Al-Sakaf. We've created an organization called Rebalance Earth, rebalance.earth, if you want to look it up online. And there we will introduce payment for ecosystem services from companies, from corporations that want to reduce their carbon footprint and put that money into communities, into protected areas, pay the rangers to protect the animals whose ecological role is to enhance the carbon sequestration of those forests. Turns out that in the Congo Basin, a forest with forest elephants sequesters and stores 7% more carbon than a forest without them. And that difference with elephants without, we can use to protect elephants and allow them to recover and recolonize forests. And where there are elephants in the Congo Basin, there are often gorillas or chimpanzees or bonobos who also benefit from this protection. So pushing that agenda is really important, getting behind rebalance.earth. And we can turn this around. We're not going to lose these species, and we are going to stabilize the climate.
That's right, Ian. We can turn this around. So what careers would you recommend for kids who want to become conservationists?
Whatever career brings you joy, but take conservation awareness with you. So we can't have everybody on the planet becoming a professional conservationist. We want all the other jobs, but whatever you do, accountant or doctor or lawyer, have a bit of your brain aware of the importance of conservation, and use your 3 Ps. And that way, everyone's involved in conservation. It can't just be for a few professional conservationists to save the world. It's got to be everyone on the planet involved.
But are there any specific careers best suited for conservation?
Engineering, or get a degree in accounting or economics or languages, language studies.
Right.
Gorillas live a lot in Francophone Africa. Learn to speak French, and then if you volunteer, you can volunteer in more countries. And that has been a well-trodden route. You volunteer for a charity, you get noticed because you're doing good work. You get a low-paid job. You know, when I worked for Diane, I was only fed. I wasn't paid. I had somewhere to stay, and I got money for food. But eventually, I hung around long enough that people started to pay me for my expertise. So I became a consultant. And yes, but I describe myself as a reluctant conservationist. My goal is to stop being a conservationist because we've sorted it, and then we can just go back to studying and appreciating, making films about and lecturing about these amazing species, not having to spend all our time trying to keep them alive.
Penny, what are your thoughts on this? What would you tell young people?
What's missing on the planet is love, is caring, and that stimulates action rather than self-interest. And with Koko, there's this just amazing connectedness that she brings to children, especially, and they're changed by it, but by a simple book, Koko's Kitten, so that can start a child on the right path, understanding that we humans are not the only ones on the planet who are conscious and brilliant and caring, so that they're our role model in a large extent. And just watching them in free living gorillas must be amazing.
Seeing free living gorillas really changed my life. That's how I ended up working at the Gorilla Foundation with Koko. So watching them live their freedom and autonomy is the way it's supposed to be. Thank you, Penny, and thank you, Ian, for joining me today. And thank you to all of you for coming and stopping by and watching the very first KokoCast. Please stay tuned for more. Take care.